Welcome to Invictus Porsche. We've got, well, both generations of the 991 here with us. This is the newer, the 991.2, whereas this the 991.1. And this video is going to be about comparing the aesthetics and the performance differences between these two, and perhaps here from a dealer's point of view, why one should consider buying one and not the other, or maybe the first generation rather than the second generation. I'll leave it to you. Before we can get into the nitty-gritty detail of either of these 911s, don't forget to press that subscribe button. Whatever money we make off the YouTube channel, or the two YouTube channels, goes to charity. On average, we make about £200 per channel. Well, actually, combined. Now we'll start off with the 991 Generation 1. This was introduced at the Frankfurt Motor Show in, I think, October or November 2011, whereas the 991.2 was introduced in and around 2015. Aesthetically, not only is the rear quite different, the grills, rather than them being horizontal lines, as a matter of fact, on the 991.2s are these vertical lines. And additionally, this is the last time Porsche actually made naturally aspirated Porsche 911s out of their 911 department, whereas the GT4s and the GT3 or the GT3 RSs continue to be naturally aspirated. But if you actually were looking for a Porsche 911, a Boxster or a Cayman out of their standard Porsche department, they were no longer naturally aspirated as of 2015, because the 718s, whether they be the Boxster or the Caymans, became turbocharged, and the 991.2s also became turbocharged. So from a compression rate point of view, in the Boxer 6-cylinder engine, you looked at basically a reduction in the compression in and around the pistons and the liners to be significantly lower in the 991.2 as opposed to the 991.1. So if you are looking for something that is a bit more raw, and I think I would say slightly visceral and slightly, let's just say dated, you bought the 991.2. And if you wanted something a bit more refined, that had the power easily available at a press of or a slight tap of the accelerator, you bought the 991.2s due to them being turbocharged. But aesthetically, they are actually both very different cars. From the get-go, you can actually see the front bumpers of the 991.2 being a lot more sculpted and just, you know, looking extremely aggressive, and just all the lines that are here, they look so much better. And as a matter of fact, when you actually compare the two cars, I mean, even the small little details like this, and these lines that are running across here, the lines that are running across there, and just looking at the beautiful shape of the 991.2 as opposed to the 991.1, here you could feel like they've become a little bit more creative, try to have more curve to it, more edges to it, and a bit more dynamicism to it, as opposed to the 991.1, you could argue might perhaps be a little bland, etc, etc, etc. But you know, both has their pros and cons. And now, you know, if you come into actually the rear of this, again, as opposed to the 991.1, it's completely two different rears between these two cars. Firstly, starting from the exhaust position, on the 991.1s, they're wider. Well, the exhaust tips are actually out here, whereas on the 991.2 they're a little bit more centralized. The grill's difference is the whole rear bumper is redesigned, and on the 991.2 you got more variety in terms of alloys as opposed to the .1, and the alloys in some ways actually look rather different. And now actually let's get into the inside. In the 991.1, we're going to talk about the glass roof. When was the glass roof actually introduced? In the 991.1s from around 2011 to 2013 to 14, they didn't actually have a glass roof. They had a sunroof that was the same body colored at the top as the rest of the car. Only later on, in around 14 or 15, they actually became glass, as you can see in this. And to me, sitting in a car with a glass roof makes a world of a difference. It's actually quite nice, quite roomy. Both of these car specs are quite similar, but you know, interior wise, there are quite significant changes in terms of the steering wheel, in terms of just how it feels like sitting in one of these, in terms of your seats, and the rest of the car being quite refined and let's just say rather plush, as opposed to the 991.1s. You know, again, you can call the interior to be slightly outdated, starting from the steering wheel here. But the rest of the interior is all very, very familiar, all very, very similar, such as having the sports exhaust button, or the pattern buttons, or the traction control, or the spoiler buttons, etc. Other than the Chrono Sport Plus or the Sport package buttons have been moved from here to this little dial up here. So a very little difference, but overall, you know, it's still some degree or some variety of a change. Let's get into the dot 2 now. Sorry, into the dot 1 now. Yeah, let's get into the dot 1 now. Steering wheel, you've got the PDK Sport steering wheel, and that had also the Sport steering wheel. Both of them have got the Sport Plus package with pattern button here. But as I said, that steering wheel was, you know, completely redesigned, had a little nice dial up here, whereas this continued to have the buttons. Well, this, I wouldn't say continue, the predecessor had the buttons right here. The rest of the Sentra is all very similar, all very familiar, but as you could see that the dot 2 was just that bit more edgy and more creative. Now let's talk about the car, where we get to view this from the front and that from the back. To me, this looks stunning, and something that I would really like to point out is that even the rear lights on the dot 1, they're just finished in a rather you know, plain flat finish, whereas these are nicely sculpted in this 3D finish. The exhaust looks absolutely, you know, mega. The whole of the rear car looks beautiful, and the car in itself actually looks a lot wider. I'm just going to pop that rear boot open just to show you what you can expect at the back here. Well, not much to expect. That's both within this or within the back of the 991.1. But you know what, there's a completely different engine in here, because as I said, they're naturally aspirated and these are not. That's a 3.8 litre, this is a 3 litre twin turbocharged. But the performance on this is, you know, you get it at about 6,000 RPM and you're blown away. It sounds amazing. You're like, wow. Because watch the other reviews and you will know what I'm talking about. Or watch even the comparison between a 997.1 to a 997.2. It's a world of a difference. But hey ho, the 911s haven't actually lost its, you know, drivability, the way they handle that characteristics that you could expect out of the 911s. They haven't lost that in any generations of the 911s, because I'm going to start it up and I will actually tell you how they actually sound. And I might as well start this one up now so you can hear this sound. And most of you would have been familiar with this. This video is really for those that are actually toying with the idea of buying this and they're perhaps thinking, well, maybe we should get one of these. Let me start it and just listen to this. I'll leave my microphone there. So you start either of these cars and they do have this really raw, exquisite sound, like angry, gruntier, and as it warms up a little bit, you hear it quieting down. And this is where the difference between these two cars come into play, whereas this is naturally aspirated and it continues to be that raw, exhilarating car, and this is like, it subdues down. And when you're doing 65 or 75 or 80 miles an hour, you're like, I'm going at 30 miles an hour. Or whereas in that, when you're doing 60 or even 50 miles an hour, it feels squick. Let me switch it off and I can talk to you about the performance numbers. What can you expect out of the 3 litre? Well, before we can actually talk about this, why don't we actually talk about the back of this? Because it would make more sense to talk to you about the numbers as we go up. Very similar layout here, but the 3.8 litre Carrera S produces 395 bhp, 440 Newton meters of torque, and the 0 to 60 is possible in 4.5 seconds. The top speed is 189 miles per hour. hold on to that thought for one moment and let's get into the back of this. The back of this produces bhp wise, wait for it, not very different bhp in comparison to the 3.8, about 414 bhp to be absolutely exact. But the real difference really comes from that this can do 0 to 60 in 4.1 seconds as opposed to 4.5 seconds. You know, that's close to half a second quicker in the .2, so that's pretty fast. Torque wise, you expect 500 Newton meters of torque as opposed to 440 Newton meters of torque. 60 Newton meters of torque might not seem like a world of a difference, but trust me, it is a big difference. And the top speed, well, might as well not even mention it, but as we're on the subject, let's just say 189 miles per hour, 190 miles per hour. Overall, MPG wise, I don't see a huge difference in terms of MPG between the two, but obviously on the books one could argue that this produces better MPG than that. But I've actually driven the 991.2 on the motorway like a granddad, and I can get, you know, above 40 miles per gallon. So whereas these, I've actually tried my best to get into the 40 MPGs, and it's not been actually possible. So hopefully you've liked just our, you know, walk around of the comparison between these two 911s. I would have loved to have taken them out on a test drive and to tell you actually more about it in terms of that, how they handle and how they drive. But this is just a walk around video to talk to you about the aesthetics of it, to talk to you about just the performance numbers, the interiors. And if you're thinking of getting either of these two, firstly, it's really important what your budget allows you to do, because once you start looking at 911s, let's just say you're like, I want a 997.1, you know, you're like, okay, I want to spend 30,000. Then you're like, oh, I could just spend 6 grand more or 10 grand more and get the S of the 997.2. But then when you start thinking of that, you're like, then I can get a slightly higher mileage, 991.1 for 45. And then you're like, but if I just put another 20 grand next to it, I can get that. It all depends on your budget. But at the end of the day, pick the car that you like, pick the car that's going to put a smile on your face and buy that car exactly. But if your budget allows you to, let's just say, spend 65 or 70,000 or 80,000 pounds, then get the most newest recent 911s possible. It doesn't matter what generation of a 911 you buy, whether that be a 996 or a 993, does not matter what generations of it you pick. They're all 911s. They're all absolutely wicked, amazing cars. There isn't actually another brand with the heritage and the history of the 911. And you know, whatever you decide, welcome to the club, welcome to the family, and stay tuned and continue watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Bye-bye. Well, one more thing. Let's hear the sound of this. Because this is naturally aspirated, you hear that burble, boom. Sounds absolutely amazing. When you drive this and you're going at 50 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour in your third or your fourth gear, it sounds wow, it blows you away. Whereas this is like, drop me the third gear, and just about that do you actually really get to appreciate the exhaust sound. But if you really want something where you actually get to engage with the car and hear the exhaust sound mega and amazing, you buy this. Thank you. Bye now.